Welcome to Market Overtime. I'm Oliver Renick. The U.S. election is weeks away, and if you're anything like me, you might still be scratching your head about what it means for your investing strategy. In the single debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, just 10 minutes out of nearly 100 were spent talking about the economy. In an effort to get more detail about what's at stake for investors, they were joined by a new fixture of the Republican Party, billionaire businessman and former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. He's also the author of a new book, Truths, The Future of America First, and was just teased by former President Trump last week as potentially being a big player in a second Trump administration. Vivek, welcome to the Schwab Network. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be on, man. Thank you for having me.
Firstly, I guess the brass tacks, do we know what kind of big player that would be? What kind of intel can you give us on what you might have in store for the next 4 years?
Yeah, look, I'll take the step by step. And President Trump and I've had some good conversations, but we got an election to win in the next 25 days. Let's take care of business there. There's a couple of options, but we'll turn to that on hopefully November 6th after we have a decisive victory the night before. So stay tuned for that one.
If you could have your pick, is there anything that you'd want?
Yeah, look, I think that what I want is to have the biggest possible impact on the country. I'll give you unsolicited advice to people who are listening, and it's a piece of advice that led me to have success, which is that it takes about as much effort to do something small and to do it well as it does to do something really big and to do it well. We have a short time we're given on Earth, and for me, part of the reason I ran for president, and certainly whatever I do next, is going to be focused on having a big impact, not a small impact. And so, whatever it is, it's going to be something expansive in a way that has major impact on what matters in the country. It's not going to be something around the edges. And so stay tuned for that.
Understood. Okay. Tell me about the book. Firstly, Truths. What's the main message you want to get across with this?
Yeah, the main message with the book was actually a lesson I learned from my presidential campaign, which is that the best moments that we had weren't when I was dunking on the left, right? I had some moments of that with the media and otherwise, but my favorite moments from the campaign were where we were actually able to persuade people who disagreed with us through open dialogue and discussion, and even at times through contentious debate. Protesters who came into an event, my rule in the campaign was, we're going to give you the mic as long as you can be respectful, sit down, and then listen to what everybody else has to say in return. There were some beautiful interactions that came out of that. I think we did change some hearts and minds along the way. The number one question I got is, how can I do that in my everyday life in a seemingly divided country? That's what this book is about. Speak the truth. We can disagree like hell and still get together at the dinner table at the end of it. That's part of the hard truths I speak to maybe those who disagree on the left. There are also some hard truths here for the right in the future of the conservative movement as well. Are we protectionists or are we libertarians? And I think both of those are strains within the America First movement. And those are some debates that I think we're going to grapple with after what I believe is going to be a successful election. And we touch on those themes in the book as well.
I love that message. Definitely one that hits home for us here, as this is a network built out of discovering truth in markets and being purely economic in our mindset. So with that in mind, I also like the message about the less dunking, more thinking. When you think about the role of the economy in this election, in the intro I just characterized it as, I think in my lifetime, the least I've heard about the economy. It's a lot more character assassination, it's social, it's culture wars. Would you agree with that description? Or am I being flippant in the way the economy has been used so far on the road to the White House? What role do you think it's playing right now between these two candidates?
Well, it depends on whether you mean what role is it playing in the debates we're having publicly, which is to say not a starring role, versus what role does it play in the actual minds of voters and who they're actually choosing, in which case I think it plays a really big role, actually. Now, as I understand, your show and your audience is focused on capital markets, which is part of how we think about the overall economic issues. But a few points that I'd like to make, probably the number one most important point, if you want to really get to brass tacks, as you put it, it's this. The tax on unrealized capital gains is, I think, the single biggest difference for capital markets between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Yes, there's a lot of differences in underlying economic policy, which we can get to. Underlying economic policy and how that relates to the stock market is often a complicated drift intermediated by things like the U.S. Federal Reserve, which we can talk about as well, that has a perverse effect on how economic progress, underlying economic progress, relates to stock market performance. But if you want to go to stock market performance and capital markets directly, what's going to have the most direct impact on stock market performance, I think it is going to be the tax on unrealized capital gains. Kamala Harris favors it, not just now, but has consistently favored it. They've put it in their budget proposals for the last several years. Donald Trump is dead set opposed to it. What does that mean and why is this important? Because one of the things that they'll say on the left is this is, as proposed, only supposed to apply to people with $100 million net worth or more. But here's why it matters to everybody, is that it will trigger a cycle of forced selling of a kind we have not seen for a very long time, arguably in a generation or more in this country, where if everybody is forced to sell to pay taxes at the exact same time, they're going to be chasing lower and lower asset prices to do it. You have people who may be sitting on large illiquid holdings that the government says is worth a lot, but they have to sell their liquid assets, including stocks and bonds, to be able to cover annual tax payments. That is the single greatest formula for a stock market crash and a second Great Depression. If we could craft one up on paper, it would be that. And I do think that is coming if Kamala Harris is elected. That's not some conspiracy theory or conjecture. This is a core signature campaign policy premise, one of the few that she's offered, and I think it's probably the one that's most relevant to your audience.
To be quite honest, first couple times I heard it, I thought maybe they had made a mistake. I don't even think we have to explore kind of the dominoes that you described for a recessionary event. I just think that it turns the entire notion of the stock market upside down, basically. So I feel like there is a very narrow window to even kind of dispute that it wouldn't be good for markets. But to the second point is, do you really think that's something that could get passed?
I think it's not out of the question. And I think it's especially not out of the question because if you look at the electoral dynamics right now, Donald Trump is actually way ahead of Republican candidates for U.S. Senate in states like Ohio, my home state, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, just to name a few. And so if Donald Trump is that far ahead, some cases double digits ahead of his own Republican counterpart, who's the Senate candidate, that means if Donald Trump loses to Kamala Harris, that means those Democrat Senate candidates are then making their way into the Senate as well. You're talking about Democratic majorities in the White House, not only a Democratic White House, but majorities in the Senate and the House. And Kamala Harris has been crystal clear. She's a skeptic of the filibuster. She is fundamentally opposed to the filibuster when it comes to advancing her own political ends. She's made that clear when it came to the Green New Deal. So I don't think it is beyond the scope of possibility. In fact, I think it is a very realistic possibility that if Kamala Harris is elected president, that you have majorities in the House and Senate for Democrats. If you have majorities in the House and Senate for Democrats, then I think it becomes actually likely that we see some form of tax on unrealized capital gains legislated into law in a way that might have been unthinkable a few years ago. I think it's going to be reality by mid-2025. That's not far from now. So people who are thinking about the market, impounding risk factors into what we think is going to happen to stocks and other securities, you have to, I think, impound the possibility that by June of next year, after the first 100 days of a Kamala Harris administration, in my view, God forbid that we get there, by June of next year, I think we are very seriously looking at a tax on unrealized gains, where you're forced to sell liquid positions to be able to cover what the government thinks is the value of your illiquid positions.
Sure.
If you're a startup founder that on paper has a billion-dollar company or unicorn,
that makes no sense.
Well, you don't really have that much cash in a bank account. You're going to have to sell whatever stocks you have to pay.
Yeah.
Same thing if you own real estate. Same thing if you own other small businesses that the government deems to have more value, landowners, farmers, and so on. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here.
Yeah, and you could be losing money and paying taxes. I'm not going to dispute anything, and it seems absurd and contrary to the very heart of the stock market. What I will, though, argue, Vivek, is some of the language that we've heard former President Trump use in the debate. To use a quote, he said he's never seen a worse period of time for the economy. You said in a Lex Friedman podcast, right now, economically, I think you meant economically, but I don't know. Tell me, you said the nation's a trajectory in decline, though you did acknowledge that the nation is still the best in the world. When you look at the stats right now, just pure economics, real GDP hit a 3% higher under Biden, 2.9 under Trump. Unemployment lows were 3.5 under Trump, 3.4 under Biden. I mean, it seems like we're in pretty good shape right now. How can we describe it so dark?
So a couple points there, and I love engaging in thoughtful dialogue, so I appreciate the question. One thing I would say is when you look at those unemployment numbers, let me ask you a question, and it is not a gotcha, but I'm just curious if you had some perspective on this. What do you think is the number one sector that has seen job growth over the course of the last 4 years? Consistently in those quarters, what's the sector that's added the jobs, boosting those so-called employment numbers?
If you're going from post-COVID, then anything related to services, anything related to things that were destroyed during COVID, just as a pure rate of change.
Rate of change, that's true amongst private sector jobs, but topping all of them is actually the government sector. So you've seen the government sector job growth outpacing the growth rates of the private sector in numerous of the years we've had under the Biden administration. And I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think that that's something that is a desired, that doesn't make that job growth actually the leading indicator of economic growth that it ordinarily would be if it was actually driven by changes in the private sector. And then there's a second factor which you mentioned, which is some of the organic boost that you would expect coming out of the pandemic anyway. When you look overall at what I think the number one economic issue is weighing on everyday Americans' pocketbooks and minds, it's the fact that prices have gone up and wages have not nearly gone up at anything resembling the same pace. It's a different way of saying that real wages, adjusted for inflation, have actually gone down over the last several years. And a big part of that is due to the inflationary policies supported by Biden, including but not limited to constrictions on energy production and the energy sector in the United States. And so I know they're making some last minute scrambles this year. They've tried to make a political gambit of releasing oil from the strategic petroleum reserves, which, by the way, is at the lowest level we've been in about 5 decades because of that. But those symptomatic last minute political vote chasing fixes can't be really a Band-Aid that still covers up for the economic sins of the last 4 years. Some of this also comes through the regulatory state. I mean, the overgrowth of the regulatory state, that's by which I mean 3-letter agencies that write into existence rules, effectively laws, that were never passed through Congress. We've seen an explosion of that in the last several years, which is, I think, an impediment and a wet blanket on the economy as well. And so, yes, I grant you, if you look at the Bidenomics and the White House purported numbers for employment, well, that's driven by the government sector. If you look at last-minute attempts at bringing up energy supply by tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, well, that isn't what they were doing over the last several years, and is a better predictor of what's going to happen over the next 4 years as well. So I believe if you're a voter on the economy, if you're a voter based on what you want's best for the stock market, I think that there's no clearer choice in this election than between Donald Trump's vision for the next 4 years versus Kamala Harris's.
Okay, come back to real wages though for a second, Vivek, because real wages, median weekly real wages, you could go real average hourly earnings as well. These are basically flat lines since the high that admittedly did come under President Trump, which was in 2020. But they're still elevated a level that was reached under the Trump administration. So yes, real wages rose under Trump. They basically stayed consistent since Biden. So I guess the question then—
against the backdrop of all other prices really
correct.
Going up,
so
and
then,
not just the prices
correct.
that are used in the calculation of real wages. Yeah.
So, okay, but if we then look at the real wages component then, you could obviously argue that real wages being stagnant under Biden is not good compared to them going up under Trump. But that also then comes to the point of inflation, which I think it gets very important here as this becomes a big voting issue. The way you see inflation, the way it was caused, who is to blame for this? And if the answer is Biden, I guess I'll get ahead by asking, why is it Biden to blame when you had $3 trillion in stimulus under Trump in response to COVID, admittedly another $2 trillion under Biden, but then how do we shift to inflation blame entirely one-sided?
Well, look, I think that the fact of the matter is, look at what inflation numbers were, area under the curve of inflation under Biden versus area under the curve of inflation under Donald Trump, and area under the curve inflation,
right,
which by which I mean the totality of compounded inflation was undoubtedly significantly higher, not only under Biden versus Trump, but under Biden versus any other president we've had in nearly the last half
What do you
century.
think caused the big spike in inflation, Vivek, from your understanding?
Yeah, I think there's two factors. I think there's two factors causing it. One is, I mean, the number one overall factor is government spending that exceeds the capacity of the private sector to absorb that government spending that drives up prices. But an exacerbating factor here is a Federal Reserve that aids and abets that by printing money to fund that government spending, which in turn creates a monetary supply version of inflation as well. So I think the combination of the Federal Reserve's response as well as the government overspending are the two drivers of inflation, and now we're suffering the consequences.
President Trump not overspending by that definition, Vivek? $3 trillion stimulus during COVID. I mean, that was Trump. I mean, I talked to the man on the street here in Chicago, and he is ready to vote for Trump because he knows he got a stimulus check.
Well, I'll give you my perspective on this, right? And one of the things I talk about in this book, right? The book is Truths, the Future of America First. I say that because I think that there are many strands of the America First movement going forward. There's more of a protectionist strain. There's one that involves more muscular government involvement. There's the version that I prefer, which I call more the national libertarian strain, which is to say that we don't want to replace the left-wing nanny state with the right-wing nanny state. We want to dismantle the nanny state and restore true free market capitalism. Not crony capitalism, not one-sided capitalism with other trading partners, but true capitalism, I think, is part of what made America great the first time and is going to make America great again. One of the things I will say about Donald Trump is what he's built here is a coalition that I do think is quite diverse. And I was in an event over the weekend with myself, Ben Carson, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK. We were all speaking at the same event, and we all, four of us, share one thing in common: is we all ran against Donald Trump for U.S. president. And yet, still on the basic rules of the road, even if we have our shades of disagreement with one another, and obviously with President Trump when we ran against him, we're still part of a broad, big tent coalition that I think is what President Trump is leading. So if you want to get into the philosophy of what we think the future direction of America First should be, that's why I wrote this book, and I encourage people to take a look at not only this book, but a lot of what I've said about what I think the future policy direction is that we need to take in our country.
Yeah.
But when I think about who's going to grow this economy between the two candidates we have here, no doubt in my mind, it's why I've supported Donald Trump, is he's leading a broad coalition that includes diverse voices on a range of questions of incremental views on what the corporate tax rate should be, or incremental views on exactly how we should or shouldn't use tariffs. Those are, by comparison to the economic worldview of Kamala Harris, right now, those are details. Roll this forward 3-4 years, I think those do become essential questions. I think those become really important questions as we think about the future of the Republican Party,
the next level
and the
of
conservative
detail
movement in 2028 and beyond. But I don't think that that's mostly what's at issue in the next 25 days.
Vivek, one of the things that you've talked about quite a bit in your vision of the future is a massive streamlining of federal operations. I've heard you say layoffs of up to 75% for government workers. I'm curious how that's economic positive, especially when you just told me that some of our biggest unemployment gains, as you see it, came from government workers. How do you stimulate the economy when you lay off, 1.7 million people day one?
I mean, 3/4 would be more than that, actually. So
you took federal, or right?
Federal employees.
Military
Federal
and non-military? So that's a big number.
So let's start with non-military.
Okay.
Is that where I would start with the civilian civil service? This is the mother of the regulatory state that's acting as a wet blanket on the overall economy. And a couple things have changed in the last year, in the last maybe couple of years, that are really major opportunities. These are not small, these are big in terms of what I'm talking about of their impact. One is the overturning of Chevron deference by the Supreme Court that says that federal courts no longer have to defer to agency interpretations of the law. And number two is a case called West Virginia versus EPA, which says that if a regulation deals with a major economic policy question, then it had to be passed by Congress rather than being written into law by the EPA or the FDA or the SEC or the FTC and so on. This is seismic. And so when we think about what's holding back American exceptionalism, American capitalism, American industrial production, American productivity, I think at the top of that list is the overgrown regulatory state in America. Okay. The Supreme Court has now laid out the red carpet for taming that regulatory state. And part of the problem is when you got a bunch of bureaucrats showing up to work who shouldn't have had that job in the first place, they find things to do. Okay. So I'm talking about mass rescissions of the regulations, mass firings across the board. And then, look, we actually have more open jobs right now in the private sector than we have people looking for work. You know what? Many of those people can find honest work in the private sector, and you could even argue that in the medium term, that could be a pro-growth measure on multiple counts.
I don't know. Are they going to go work for NVIDIA? I'm trying to think about where the biggest growth is right now. Are these people going to have skill sets to transfer over to those open jobs, Vivek, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, look, I think that the reality is the number one service we're going to do by letting the federal bureaucracy go is by ungirding the regulatory state from the private sector, all right? Unshackle the private sector from the clasp of that regulatory state so we can drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear energy, embrace innovation even in new sectors ranging from AI to digital currency, Bitcoin to the future of crypto, all in the private sector. Those are just examples of areas that have been immensely constrained by the three-letter agencies in the regulatory state. Now, where those people find jobs, I'll just give you my own perspective. I hope this isn't a controversial one. I don't think the job of the federal government is to provide employment opportunity through work in the government. So if that's what we're relying on the federal government to do, then I think we're making a bad mistake. Where we're saying that our unemployment numbers are going to go up if the federal government doesn't employ them. I think that is, with due respect, in my view, a mistaken vision of the role of the federal government. I think the role of government broadly is to provide for the security of its people and to protect private property rights, not to ensure employment through government service. And if others disagree with that view, they're entitled to that view. But I think the majority of Americans are with me on this one.
A philosophical point I won't dispute. You mentioned crypto. Definitely want to ask you about this, Vivek. The warm embrace, one might argue a flip in the former president's view on crypto, the Bitcoin speech that he gave at the conference. What do you see as being the cause for that beyond kind of the libertarian mindset as sort of the Wild West of crypto? You're a businessman. You came to your riches through the public market, through profits. Crypto so far, still in the look for a use case. How would you bring people into that? You really see that as an economic on-ramp for people?
Well, look, I think that I'm not one of these people that says that crypto or Bitcoin is the one all end all solution to all problems on earth. And that's something that I've shared with my friends in the Bitcoin world as well, is to say that somehow this is going to solve every problem from world peace to our national debt.
I think I heard you say you own like 1% in your own holdings?
Yeah, my public records, the beauty of it is they're public as of when I ran for U.S. president, so people could check out what my holdings roughly were. But my own view is this, and you asked about President Trump's, I would call it a growth in his mindset on this issue. It's one of the things I respect about him. I can speak to this because he and I had the conversation shortly after I left the presidential race, firstly about his opposition, which I voiced in my own presidential campaign, to a central bank digital currency. The first time I raised this idea with him, he didn't immediately adopt it, but he thought about it. He weighed the pros and cons. And then a few weeks later, he comes out, or a few days later, in New Hampshire to adopt the position that he's then stuck to since then. If you listen to his speech at the Bitcoin conference, he referenced some of the conversations that he and I have had as well. That's something that we should want in the leader, actually. Not somebody who pretends to know everything already on day one, as many politicians, and I've met a lot of them at this point. Most of them, when it comes to these kinds of issues, will try to pretend like they know what they actually don't. President Trump is not that person, actually. He's willing to hear the best arguments for the other side and grow or even evolve his position. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we should want more of rather than less of in politics.
Sure.
Now, part of what I think, this is more just descriptive rather than a policy perspective here, but for your audience, they may be interested in this in terms of just a perspective on the future. I think one of the things that we've seen in the culture, particularly in the Bitcoin world, but in the crypto world as well, is the maximalist attitude. Okay, to say that we're going to go all in on Bitcoin or all in on whatever your favorite coin is, and that becomes the character of the community.
Usually because you're trying to sell it to someone else for more.
You can. I'm not going to impute motives broadly. Different people have different approaches and motives, and I'm not going to paint different communities with a broad brush. But that generally has been the character of a lot of people who have been, believers or whatever in a particular coin. Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to see happen culturally is the application of modern portfolio theory. If I'm going to use words and tell me if you need me to define them, but like the efficient frontier of developing a well-balanced portfolio. Okay. Classical portfolio theory of developing that efficient frontier demands the inclusion of what in the long run are supposed to be theoretically uncorrelated assets, not in a maximalist sense, to say you're going to go all in and put 80% of your portfolio into one particular asset, but instead to look at whether or not you have a 1 or a 2 or a 3% portfolio allocation to a kind of asset that belongs in your portfolio, but in a small way that still adds something and puts you on a further out efficient frontier than the one that you're already on. And I think that's something that's been missing, actually. I don't think that there are thoughtful financial institutions that have broadly applied classical portfolio theory to the realm of digital assets, including Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Part of that's due to the regulatory uncertainty. Say what you will, maybe you want more regulation, maybe you want less, but at the very least, you should at least want regulatory clarity and certainty about whether or not a particular token is or is not a security. And I do think that's one of the things that President Trump has been clear about, is the importance of regulatory clarity for this space. And so if he is successful in this election, I predict that we're going to see a little bit of a transformation of what you called kind of the Wild West and the maximalist outlook, in particular coins or Bitcoin, to one of more of even a kind of normalization of the inclusion of some exposure to Bitcoin or other forms of digital assets in the future in a standard well-balanced portfolio, applying efficient frontier theory and classical portfolio theory, but in a way that includes rather than systematically excludes or ignores these digital assets. And I do think that's a relevant potential development for the future of capital markets that I think is going to be culturally, not even just through policy, but through cultural normalization, going to be probably an important part of the next few years, especially if President Trump's elected. Quite possibly either way, but I think even more so if President Trump's elected.
Well, the ETF's certainly a pretty big step towards that direction. I wonder if adding Bitcoin reserves to the government's balance sheet is a step too far, Vivek. If the president does, if it is Trump, and if the Bitcoin crowd says, are you going to follow through with this idea, and he comes to you with it, what do you say? Most volatile asset in history. Should we have it in reserves?
Financial freedom. I stand for financial freedom, and part of what I believe is that we ought to have healthy debate, even on the right, and about the future of the America First movement. I've laid out in my book, like I said, there's the divide between the protectionist and the state, muscular state intervention camp versus the libertarian and truly national liberty direction, which says I don't want the regulatory state messing around with private markets for either left-wing or right-wing or any-wing purposes. I've been pretty clear where I land on those debates, but to take a big step back, when you look at the next 25 days and the path to the election, back to your question about who's going to foster economic innovation and economic growth, I think the answer between the candidates we have for independents or financially focused, capital market focused investors, I think the answer to that question becomes pretty clear. I also think that regulatory clarity is the least we could ask for. I think it's frankly egregious that you ask the chief regulator of certainly the cryptocurrency markets whether Ethereum is or is not a security that's covered by the securities laws, and the person who leads the SEC can't even answer that question to Congress. Yeah. I think that's regulation by enforcement. And you don't want to live in a country that's playing a game of musical chairs that when the music turns off, you find out what the rules actually were. No, you should say what the rules are beforehand, enforce them even-handedly, do so in the manner that's actually constrained by the laws passed through Congress rather than making them up along the way. That's what our founding fathers wanted, and I think whether you're on the left or the right, that's what we should want for economic growth and productivity in this country as well.
Sure, and I think some of those big coins probably more like commodities. So a Bitcoin balance sheet, Bitcoin reserves, you're not gung-ho on it.
Well, there's a lot of flavors of what that could mean. And that proposal, I think, was offered as a thought experiment, and I think that it's great for us to be able to have, productive dialogue. I think that it expands the frontiers around a new issue to be able to slice and dice it from different ways. But in the specifics of policy, I will say that President Trump's been a lot clearer than Kamala Harris of where he is on a couple of these principles relating to the future of government attitudes towards Bitcoin and financial innovation. I'm pro-innovation. I'm anti-regulatory overreach. That's where I land. And then, I think that one of the cases I make in this book is that we don't want to replace the left-wing regulatory state to an expanded regulatory state that advances our objectives. Okay. I'd rather just have a regulatory state that steps out of the way and enforces the laws that Congress passes, but that's about it, rather than making up new ones along the way. So that's, I think, the mode that we got to stay on.
Vivek, thanks a lot for your time. Enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it very much.
Great to see you, man. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Vivek Ramaswamy, author of Truths, The Future of America First. I think with a helpful look into the mindset of potentially the next administration and the event that former President Trump returns to the White House. Thank you for joining me on Market Overtime. Tune in every week for new episodes. You can watch all the interviews on our YouTube page and on schwabnetwork.com, of course. I'm Oliver Renick. I'll see you next time.